Across old legends, there is a feature we are expected to stop seeing the moment it appears. The trees are always treated as exaggeration, the harmless inflation of ancient minds trying to make the world feel more sacred than it was. But the repetition does not feel harmless for very long. These trees are not merely large. They are world-defining, horizon-shaping, so immense that human life gathers around them as though around permanent structures of reality. Different cultures preserve the same impossible scale with strange composure. And that raises the harder possibility. What if the old stories were not enlarging the world through symbolism, but preserving the memory of one? What first unsettled me was not that old cultures spoke of giant trees, but the manner in which they spoke of them. Not as ornaments of belief, not as decorative impossibilities placed at the edge of sacred narrative to make the universe feel grander than it was. They spoke of them with the steadiness people reserve for things that belong to the structure of reality. The descriptions feel less like invention than orientation. Again and again, the great tree is not simply holy. It is central. It organizes the sky, the land, the movement between worlds, the arrangement of life itself. It stands where a civilization places what cannot be omitted. We are trained to translate that immediately into symbol. The world tree becomes connection. The cosmic trunk becomes spiritual metaphor. The descending roots become allegory. I do not reject symbolism. I want to be precise about that. Myths often carry several kinds of meaning at once, but symbolic language usually fastens itself to something a culture already knows how to experience. It does not emerge from nowhere. The metaphor is rarely the beginning. More often, it is what remains after the original frame has started to fade. That distinction matters. If separated traditions repeatedly preserve the image of trees whose scale exceeds anything in the present world, then the repetition asks more of us than casual dismissal allows. Whether human cultures kept arriving, independently and with remarkable consistency, at the same environmental impossibility for reasons of taste alone, or they were carrying forward damaged memories of a world whose proportions had ceased to survive into the ages that inherited the stories. Neither explanation is light, but only one begins to account for the unusual firmness of the pattern. Look closely at the role these trees play. In Norse cosmology, Yggdrasil is not a flourish, attached to the story after the fact. It is the operating axis through which realms are related and made coherent. In Mesoamerican traditions, the world tree binds vertical levels of reality with a confidence that feels structural, not ornamental. In Indian cosmological and sacred traditions, immense trees recur as shelters, centers, continuities, world-arranging presences whose implied scale exceeds the ordinary environment. The names change, the theology changes, the stories change. The environmental logic does not. The tree is too large for the world we now inhabit, yet it is described as though native to reality rather than foreign to it. Once the category myth has been laid over material like this, however, almost anything can be made harmless. Size becomes exaggeration before the reading begins. Specificity becomes atmosphere. Repetition becomes archetype in the thinnest possible sense, a psychological pattern floating free of any physical reference. The legends remain intact only because their physical implications have already been removed. A world of giant trees is declared impossible in advance, and every surviving trace of such a world is translated into metaphor, whether the original tradition demanded that translation or not. But traditions often preserve facts after they lose the language required to explain those facts directly. Flood memory is the obvious example. It travels. It absorbs ritual, morality, theology, and local detail. It becomes story. Yet beneath those later layers, the memory of actual inundation often still appears to persist. Ruins produce myths. Lost cities produce myths. Geological trauma produces myths. It would be strange if lost environmental scale did not produce myths as well. In a sense, myth may be what memory becomes when the world that made it has disappeared, but the impression has not. And once that possibility is admitted, even provisionally, the old material begins to change in tone. The exaggerated scale starts to feel less like flourish than drift. Sacred language starts to sound less purely devotional and more preservational, as though later cultures were straining to keep intact the enormity of something they could no longer verify. The repeated link between giant trees and ordered civilization becomes especially difficult to dismiss. These are not always stories of remote wilderness. They are often stories of placement, alignment, gathering, passage, and power. Peoples orient themselves around these trees. Worlds are measured through them. They mark centers. They bind levels. They do the work an immense physical structure would do in a human environment large enough to require one. Then the question of scale memory enters. Human beings frequently preserve relational truth after exact measurement has vanished. A doorway remembered as immense may once have been practical before the users changed. A chamber remembered as impossible may once have served a function no later, generation continued. We have seen this pattern elsewhere, especially in inherited architecture, where oversized forms are reclassified as ceremonial once their original operation becomes unintelligible. The same collapse may be present here. A tree once understood as infrastructure, landmark, shelter system, environmental organizer, or civilizational reference point could survive into later language as sacred impossibility once the world that justified it was gone. And when that reference disappears, ridicule tends to arrive very quickly. The memory is allowed to survive only on the condition that no one reads it, closely enough to ask what it is still trying to report. This is where the landscape begins pressing back. I'm not saying of every mesa is a stump, every mineral tower a fossil, every colossal formation proof of lost biological scale. I will not claim more than the evidence supports, but I am saying that the language of official classification has a way of making resemblance irrelevant by procedure. Once a form has been named geologically, the question is considered closed. And yet certain terrains carry silhouettes and proportions so suggestive, so strangely trunk-like in their visual behavior, that the old legends begin to push against that vocabulary with renewed force. At minimum, the stories and the land do not feel wholly unrelated. They feel like two damaged survivals of the same broken memory, one preserved in narrative, the other in form. That does not prove the giant trees. It does something more important. It keeps the question alive. Once a culture loses the scale required to understand an inherited memory, it develops methods for making that memory safe. The first is metaphor. Anything too large, too strange, too destabilizing is lifted out of physical reality and placed into the symbolic register, where it can still be admired without needing to be believed. The second is classification. Whatever resembles a surviving fragment of the older world is assigned an approved category: geological, devotional, decorative, ritual, and once the label is applied, the question is considered finished. The third is ridicule. Once an interpretation has been marked unserious, no institution needs to refute it. It only needs to ensure that serious people learn not to ask it again. I'm not suggesting that every scholar is consciously defending a falsehood. That would be cruder than the mechanism we are actually dealing with. Systems do not require coordinated deceit in order to produce silence. They require incentives, They require habits of language. They require journals, funding paths, professional reflexes, and disciplinary boundaries that quietly sort living questions from dead ones. Under such conditions, the memory of giant trees does not need to be disproven in order to vanish from serious inquiry. It only needs to be filed, confidently enough, under myth. After that, its physical implications fade on their own. What matters is not one interpretation, but the enclosure created by many interpretations acting together. The legends become psychology, the landscapes become geology, the sacred diagrams become theology, the oversized forms and inherited traditions become artistic emphasis. None of these readings is automatically false. The issue is cumulative. Taken together, they leave almost no space in which a material reading can remain active long enough to gather force. Every fragment is translated downward before it can connect with the others. The world is reduced, piece by piece, until only manageable meanings remain. And once that enclosure is complete, forgetting begins to feel like sophistication. The modern mind learns to take pride in its refusal to read ancestral scale claims literally. To believe less becomes a sign of intelligence. To strip the world of enormity, to interpret everything upward into symbol and downward into category, begins to look like maturity. But that confidence may conceal something smaller and more ordinary. We may not be transcending the old stories. We may be inheriting them under diminished conditions and mistaking our loss of environmental reference for intellectual progress. The stories remained immense. Our permitted image of the world contracted around them. That is why the question of giant trees is not merely botanical. It is civilizational. What sort of atmosphere would sustain such vertical growth? What sort of soil depth, hydrology, energy flow, and ecological stability would be required? What would distance feel like to human beings living beneath trunks that served as landmarks across entire regions? Beneath canopies capable of altering light, moisture, and wind on scales we no longer experience? Even religion would change under those conditions, not because ancient people were more credulous, but because transcendence would have been encountered through forms of living magnitude we no longer possess. And once that possibility enters, other anomalies begin to shift in meaning. Oversized thresholds, impossible foundations, sacred geographies arranged around vertical centers, roads and placements that seem disproportionate to the uses later societies assign to them. I want to be careful here. Pattern recognition becomes reckless very easily. Not every large doorway belongs to a vanished giant ecology. Not every monumental form points back to lost biological scale. But the categories we inherited may be far less stable than they appear. If the environmental frame changed enough, then many old forms could survive into our era still visible, still measurable, and no longer fully legible. That gives the legends a different emotional force. They stop sounding like the fantasies of people who knew less, and start sounding like the damaged inheritance of people who once knew something we no longer know how to test. The giant tree becomes more than a marvel. It becomes a unit of distance between worlds, the earlier one that generated the memory, and the later one that can preserve only its outline. That is why repetition matters. Not because repetition proves literal truth by itself, but because repetition is often what survives after direct knowledge has broken into forms durable enough to endure. The old world, if it carried such trees, is gone in every practical sense. The forests are not standing for inspection. The atmospheric conditions that may have fed them are not available for comparison. Whatever human systems once oriented themselves within that scale have been renamed, resized, or buried beneath explanations better suited to a smaller world. But the legends remain with a persistence that official culture does not quite know how to absorb. They are too widespread to erase, too impossible to integrate, and too familiar to alarm most people unless they are read slowly enough to regain their weight. And once that happens, the old dismissal loses some of its authority. The question is no longer whether every legend is literal in modern terms. The question is whether official culture has earned the certainty with which it reduces all such memory to symbol. I do not think it has. Too many traditions preserve too much structural agreement for the matter to be waved away as ornament. Something is being remembered, however imperfectly, and the persistence of that remembrance may tell us more about the lost scale of the world than our classifications are willing to admit. I do not have a final proof to offer. I'm not sure anyone does. What remains instead is a pattern, narrative memory, physical resemblance, inherited proportion, and interpretive refusal, all occupying the same space at once. The giant trees may be gone. The language built around them is not. It waits in myths, in sacred diagrams, in the uneasy behavior of certain landscapes, and in the reflexive certainty with which modern systems insist that none of it can mean what it appears to mean. Perhaps that certainty is the strangest artifact of all. The legends kept the trees alive longer than the institutions did, and somewhere inside that endurance is the possibility that humanity did not invent an impossible past, but remembered one badly enough to survive it. The world became smaller. The stories did not. They still rise above us, patient and improbable, like the last visible crowns of a forest buried so deeply beneath official language that only myth can still reach it.